Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari and today I am going to do my December wrap up. Now I already did and released an end of the year wrap up, so this seems like a tiny little bit redundant, but every other month this year I specifically talked about which books I had read for that month, so it seems kind of bad to leave out the books from December. So December wrap up, if you don't care, don't watch the video. It's not gonna hurt my feelings, I promise. Anyway, for December, I read 23 books in December for a total of 9,581 pages. That was 417 pages per book, which means I read a whole lot of thick books in December and about 309 pages per day. 14 of those books were fantasy books, so apparently I was reading a bunch of fantasy in December. I didn't plan to specifically read fantasy in December, it just happened that way. 3 were general fiction, 2 were nonfiction, 1 horror, 1 thriller, and 1 science fiction book. 17 of the books I read were adult books. 4 of them were young adult and 1 was targeted for children. 8 of the authors I read were male, 13 were female. 2 books that I read had multiple authors by different genders. Now, I'm gonna be real honest with you, almost all of these books I have talked about in other videos already, so I will link some of those videos up in the eye, but every single one of them will be linked down in the comments if you want more information on some of these books, or any information on some of them, because some, like my Century Reads that I have its own wrap up for, I skip. So the first 2 books that I read in the month of December were actually from November's Century Reads month. I didn't necessarily force myself to complete each decade in a month, but I kind of mostly stuck to that trend. So 2 books from the 2000s, and then 10 books that were my December Century Reads from the 2010s, which all 12 of those books have 2 separate of their own videos that will be linked. I is over there, right? Yeah, it'll be linked in the eye and in the comments down below. In November, one of my goals was to read the 20 books that were nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards Fantasy in 2020, and that was announced on December 8th, so I threw a couple of them in December, and that was 3 books. Again, that has its own video, so I will link it up there. Now, 4 books that I read in December came out of book boxes, which you will see a lot higher trend towards in 2021. Instead of just adding all of these books that I don't necessarily want to my physically owned TBR and then having to read a shit ton of books that will probably end up being mediocre to me all at once because I'm trying to clear off that owned TBR, I'm going to try to read the books that come in my book boxes the day or the month I get them, and then put reviews of those books in the book boxing on video. So for December, I read The Wolves of Winter by Tyrell Johnson, which came in my Peace and Pages box. That was one of my worst books of the year. There was so much aggressive, problematic content in there that the story was just overwhelmed by the microaggressions. And it could have potentially been a decent, maybe not a 5-star, but maybe a 3-star story if he would have just gotten a sensitivity reader instead of just gone on about how white men know everything. Next in my Unplugged book box, I got a book called The Lady Upstairs by Haley Sutton. I did not particularly care for that book at all either. It wasn't that book wasn't problematic, it was just the tropes in the book were not tropes that I particularly appreciate. It was about women having sex with wealthy men, recording themselves having sex with these wealthy men, and then blackmailing them, saying that they're going to release these sex tapes to either their wives or the public, because maybe like the guy's a little abusive in his kinks and stuff like that. And that just, it felt icky to me, even though I can completely understand why some people might like that trope. Next was an advent calendar book called The 12 Days of Bookmas by Once Upon a Book Club, and you got a short story every single day, and you would open a advent calendar gift for each of the 12 short stories. So that was fun. The book itself was like, the short stories were very generic and they were written around what the gifts were. So not like the greatest thing that I ever read, but the overall idea of it was fantastic. One of the books that came in that advent calendar was a book called Song of a Captive Bird by Jasmine Darznik, I think is how you say her last name. I could be way off and completely butcher that, and I apologize if that is so. But that book my mom wanted, so she told me to read it and then leave it with her. So I did, and it was a book about a woman in the, like, what is that called? It was like a revolution in Iran in like the 1950s and 1960s, where before the revolution, women could like wear short skirts, wear makeup, show their face, and then after the revolution, women were like sequestered and had to wear, I don't know the terminology, I apologize, but they were more enforcing like religious clothing for women. And this is a book about a young woman who didn't want to be married. She wanted to be a poet, and her like life living as like a fallen woman or something along those lines, like during this revolution time. This character, the main female poetess character, is like based on a real person. Like, this is a real poetess who lived in Iran during these times. The story is just fictionalized about her because she is not alive anymore. So there's no like actual history of her life. It's just like a romanticized history of like what people knew about her, if that makes sense. It was okay. Not really my type of book. It wasn't like emotionally traumatizing enough, I guess, to be a book that I particularly enjoyed. And the character's personality just wasn't something that like did a lot for me. But I could see like a whole lot of people enjoying that book. It was just one that was mediocre for me. Those are all of the books that I read. I will link all of the respective videos that those books were featured in, like the unboxing videos, in the comments, as always. The next 3 books that I read were arcs, and in December I try to go through my NetGalley and like if there's any arcs that like they've already been released but I haven't, like I missed the release date for reading them for whatever reason, like maybe I was no longer interested in it or I was too busy, whatever. I tried to read them in December so they're not sitting in there for more than 12 months max. And the first book in that was The Last Smile in Cinder City by Luke Arnold, and this was a book that I think I had gotten from NetGalley in December of 2019. So it was almost a complete year that had been sitting on my NetGalley shelf. And I lost interest in it after requesting it, obviously. And it makes sense that I lost interest in it because I can barely remember what it's about. It involved a private eye, and I just particularly do not like private eye tropes. They feel very misogynistic to me. This one, I don't remember any misogyny. It was just the trope overall felt that way. And I think it's about a world where magic used to exist, but humankind destroyed the well of magic, or a well of magic, and now magical creatures have been periodically dying because they're the lack of magic. And then some like died instantly, some have lasted but are like fading, and then some seem to be okay. But yeah, it was basically like humans were the weakest creatures in a world full of magical creatures, and now they are the strongest creatures because all of the magical creatures are losing their life force. And it's been like 6 years since the end of the world or whatever. And the protagonist had something to do with like the cause of the end of the world, which is alluded to like all the fucking time, but you only really get like what happens or like what exactly he did at the very end of the book. And it was okay. It was very forgettable, but I don't remember it being like particularly horrible. Next, I got like, I guess it's an unsolicited arc for a book called Rebel Girls Lead, which is a children's book about female leaders. And most of these women are still alive today, and various leaders in their different fields. So you've got everything from like politicians to like Lady Gaga and her charities, to like gymnasts and other sports stars, but like women who lead in some aspects of their lives. And it's really just like a single page of a very, very short summary of like who that woman is and what makes her a great leader. And it's made for children. So this is like something you would buy your little girl. It's a picture book and everything. And then basically you read this to them and they can decide like, oh, this is a woman that I want to be like. And then you could probably expand on her knowledge of that specific woman, because this is all of the Rebel Girls books are just about women, women role models, but very short, that need to be expanded on after your child, male or female, decides that that's the woman they want as a role model. So I do recommend this for anybody who has children, girls or boys, because boys can have female role models too. But if you just want a book to show your children good or potentially good role models, then sure, it's a good book for that. It's not really for adults. Like, the concepts in it are way too simplistic to be like, as an adult, trying to figure out who's a good role model for you, because yeah, the concepts are just, it's too much of somebody's life to put in like one page of a child's picture book. The last book that I read of the month, but not the last book on this list, was The Ruthless Lady's Guide to Wizardry by C.M. Wagner, and I believe that book releases in January this month. I will have the date that it releases on the screen somewhere because I just didn't write it down and I don't remember off the top of my head. This was like a Victorian, like Sherlock Holmesy kind of murder mystery, set in like an it was like a fantasy, I guess, Victorian England. where it's not actually in England and none of the towns are actually towns that exist, but it gives off very Victorian England steampunky vibes. And it follows a fire mage, very low class, very poor, who needs to do something to get rent, and she finds a ad in the paper to be a bodyguard for this woman who needs to go into seclusion for her marriage. So all of her bodyguards have to be females because she can't see any men during this time frame. And it starts off as like the bodyguard thing, but then it evolves into into something else completely, where it's more of like a trying to discover like the source of a drug. This was long-winded, kind of like my explanation of it. It was very convoluted. There's just too much of it. It wasn't bad, it was just too long for what it needed to be, and it wasn't like quite as funny as, or to like make up for like how long the content was. So like I said, if it's something that really sounds like it would appeal to you, then maybe read it. Every other YouTuber that I've heard talk about it has either like felt like I do, or was like, oh yeah, it was okay, but it was too long, or just straight up DNF'd it because they were bored. So not great, but I didn't think that it was like awful by any means, and I had some fun with it. So there you go. The final book that I read this month, oh my god, this was supposed to be my November book club book, and I started it like November 2nd as an audiobook, and I just could not get into this damn book. I got maybe 40% between December, or no, I got maybe 40% into the book on audio between November 1st and like December 30th. And then I finished the last 60% in 2 hours when I started reading the damn thing physically. It was just, I was not listening to it in audio. And it was another one of those books that was like mediocre to me. There was interesting parts of it. I guess I should tell you the name of the damn book, shouldn't I? It was Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, and there was multiple reasons why it took me a long time to get through this. First, I just don't do great with fantasy books on audiobook. Second, it's young adult, and young adult fantasy tends to feel too simplistic to me. Like everything turns out too easily. Like you're destined to do this, so it's going to happen, and there's not going to be any like extreme barriers in your way. The other problem I had with this book is I've heard so many people talk about it where they like this book, but the second book in the series is like one of the most awful things they've ever read. So I didn't have a whole lot invested in this book because I know I'm never going to read anything else in the series. But I did like the audiobook for learning how to pronounce characters' names. Like once I started reading it, I realized that none of those characters I would have pronounced their names wrong or correctly if once I actually started physically reading it, I realized that not a single character would I have pronounced their name correctly if I hadn't heard the voice actress pronouncing them correctly for a while. Oh, that actually reminds me of another thing that I really disliked about the voice actress is the way she spoke just made any dialogue like overbearing, where it would be like, Zaylee saw Zane go towards the guard, and she would be like, Zane! No, Zane! fine. And you're just like, oh my God, I can't listen to you scream every single time you do dialogue. And I think that's just one of those things where it's like young adult voice actors make the young adult books far more dramatic than they need to be, but like a childhood kind of dramatic. And I think that probably put me off on reading it. Like, not something I realized at the time, but something like reflecting on it and how quickly I could get through it once I started reading it. I think that had a lot to do with it, where it was just like jarring to hear any dialogue in this book was filled with a whole lot of dialogue. But overall, I didn't hate the book, and I loved some aspects of like the lore, and the characters' names and like the rep and everything like that. Like all of that stuff was cool. It was just a 3-star because the plot points were solved too easily. So nothing like wrong with the book itself. It was just the intended audience was not me, if that makes sense. But that is all of the books that I read in December, and thank you for showing up. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.